Max mustered her courage to look towards the man filled with eyes she could only fathom to be filled with enmity. Her father's voice echoed persistently in her ears like a haunting melody. Make it clear to Calypso that you can't annul your marriage. Once again, if you insult the family, you'll pay heavily. But her lips only clung tightly to one another as if an invisible glue were applied on it. What should I say? To her, she was just another intimidating man but her husband. Stop trembling. The man suddenly raised his voice, making her step away reflexively out of fear. As soon as her foot touched backward, the man came closer, his muscles visibly straining from tension. Stop looking at me as if you've seen a disgusting thing. Am I some kind of despicable monster to you? Riften's words unexpectedly caught her off guard. I. Riften cast her a fierce glance, only to sweep his hair a moment later from exasperation. Max's eyes dimmed. In less than 5 minutes of their reunion he was already displeased. And to think she still had to persuade him to reconsider a divorce. Her lips were trembling against her will. Please, just say something. She urged herself in silence. It's just. I'm so nervous, why don't know what to say. She could feel her cheeks burn and the unmistakable burning pain in her eyes that signaled her incoming tears. But she couldn't make him see that, to cry like a child in front of him. Desperation clawed at her immediately. I don't think why you are a monster, not a thought. I'm nervous, yes, trembling, stop. Her tongue didn't listen more than usual. She felt intense humiliation and couldn't bear to look him in the face anymore. It was too much of a feat in the first place. It was impossible for her to persuade him when she could not even speak properly. Max bowed her head instead, the blush from her cheeks traveling all the way to the tip of her ears. She might as well keep her mouth shut, she mused dismally. A mature woman wouldn't stutter like fool. In the end, she felt as if she were standing naked in front of him. Shit. Her shoulders flinched at the gentle voice that contrasted with the curse word. Her father was right, no man in the continent would ever want her as a wife. How could she even dare ask this man to refuse to marry a daughter of royalty, who was miles better than her? The helplessness that surged afterward did little to keep the tears at bay. At that moment, she felt the touch of cold skin on her cheek and was instantly frightened. A hand wearing the hard iron gloves used by the knights held her face with an uncanny tenderness. Open your mouth, he mumbled, almost too soft for her to hear. Max didn't understand what was going on and stared blankly at Riften's dark eyes like night in front of her. The man sighed, as if his patience was being tested. Then he slightly lowered her chin, forcing her lips to part. Soon, he deftly moved his hot tongue inside her mouth. Max caught his arm in surprise, and she thought the man mumbled irritably because of it. He bit her lips, yet another startling remark coming from him. Fuck. I should have taken my armor off first. Max couldn't come to her senses, she was unable to understand what was happening out of the blue. Her thoughts still hazy, Riften pushed her back. From where they were standing awkwardly, the next moment they were resting on sofa, with him stooping on one knee next to her thigh. With practiced ease, he flung his gauntlet off in one motion. His long, hard fingers that slipped out of the silver gloves softly wrapped around her face. Instinctively, she grabbed at him by the hem of his clothes. Without another second, he locked his lips with her again, taking off the gloves on his other hand. His now free hand wounded into her hair, his hot palm squeezing her head nearer him. His tongue scoured her mouth ferociously, not sparing her teeth or tongue from his onslaughts. With his every move, Max found herself out of breath. When she felt dizziness descend from the lack of oxygen, she finally pushed his chest out, and the man nibbled on her bottom lip. Just a little more. Her heart throbbed at his low voice. His hot hand once again pressing against the back of her back impatiently and moving past her face and neck to settle on her chest. As she twisted away in embarrassment, he pulled her back and made her lie on the sofa. Without the least hesitancy, He pulled her skirt down, exposing her skin to the cool air. Riftan. Max cried out. Having already experienced it one time, she was immediately aware of what his actions meant. Max stared at the door of the drawing room in puzzlement. She could only think fervently, what is he doing in broad daylight, in the drawing room of all places, where anyone can go in and out freely? But it seemed that the man didn't care about propriety at all. He dived for her neck in urgency, tracing kisses on her skin as he pressed his hardened body between her legs. Max let out a surprised shriek. Whenever the man slowly rubbed himself on her, his protective gear wrapped around his thick thighs grazed her legs, the touch of cool metal making her skin erupt in goosebumps. Max felt embarrassment at the intimacy she couldn't stand and shut her lids tightly. Suddenly, Riftan leaped up, hurriedly covering her almost nakedness with his large cloak. Only then did she realize that there was someone watching them. A man dressed like Riftan stood stiffly outside the door with a perplexed face. "What are you peeking at like a rat?" Riftan bellowed at once. With Riftan's fiery cry, Max raised her head in a hurry. The man at the receiving end of his anger looked perplexed by his overbearing demeanor. He frowned and yelled back. "How would I know someone was doing that inside the drawing room? I just didn't feel the need to knock, as I usually do, because the leader would notice me right away. Get the fuck out of here." She turned pale at her husband's cry. "If he goes out, then, what happens next?" Max entreated the man with a look begging him not to leave from behind her husband's back. But the man merely gritted his teeth and muttered something harsh under his breath before turning away. "I have got a carriage waiting outside." "You said you weren't here to ogle Cross Castle." Riftan replied without missing a beat, "Tell him to wait." The man gave a long, weary sigh, finding the situation helpless. "Don't drag for long." He cast a disapproving glance at Max and shut the door behind him loudly and went away. Max's gaze drifted towards Riftan, roughly scratching his back and eyeing her with an intense look. His severe gaze made Max curl up and Riftan laughed sardonically at the sight. "Don't shiver, I'm not going to rush at you again." Then he added after some pause, "Shit. I had no intention to attack here from the start." She didn't dare lift her head to look at him, but merely fixed her gaze on her fingers clasped together. He rose to his feet and straightened up his disheveled clothes. "You heard that too, didn't you? There's a carriage waiting outside. We'll have to leave right away." She felt her skin cool, all the blood drained from her face. He was leaving her as quick as he came, she hadn't yet to say a word of persuasion, nor a coherent sentence. But the panic-stricken Max couldn't even think of fixing her loose attire, rather, she grabbed the hem of his clothes in anguish. Wait a minute, let's talk." Riftan cut her off abruptly, "We need to leave in a hurry. Have your maid get your luggage ready first. I'll hear what you have to say when we're in the carriage." Max, who was frightened to the point she trembled again, paused for a moment, confusion evident in her orbs. She asked him again with a puzzled look. "And my baggage?" "Yes. Your things. Pack the things you need to bring," he spoke now in a soft tone, quite a difference from the bitter shouting from before. Still, Max felt his words were incomprehensible. She owlishly blinked at him, of which made him heave a great sigh. With quick hand gestures, he promptly arranged her unkempt dress and raised her from the sofa. He then called for a maid standing outside the door, ordering for Max's luggage. Only when she heard that did it dawn on Max, he was taking her with him. She was struck with incredulity. "Only get what you need. We can't be delayed further." Max bit out a reply immediately, "Why yes, I won't pack anything else, maybe rice, but there's not much, only a few." "Good. Then let's go. I'll provide the things you need upon arrival at my estate." The man called for the maid back with Max's luggage and had her lead them out of the drawing room. His long, hurried strides made Max almost run just to keep up with him. Meanwhile, Max was still with a befuddled mind, the situation was going to the outcome she had least unexpected. Why your estate? Why? He glared from over his shoulder and sarcastically said, is it strange that a poor, low-ranking knight would have his own territory? He added further, I was knighted, consecrated by King Reuben himself. With my last name as yours, you should have lived there after our marriage. Her puzzlement grew with every passing information. A house I should have been living in? Her thoughts unheard, he strode down the stairs in rapid steps and out into the wide garden, unwilling to explain further. Next to the cross-huge fountain, a luxurious carriage led by 4 horses was parked where a few knights gathered. As soon as they came up to them, the noise from the men clamored down. Some of the knights glanced at Max standing behind Riften, their curious gazes almost leaving a hole on her face. At Max remaining still behind him, Riften turned back. What are you still doing? Quickly get inside the carriage. But, my father should be waiting for me. Let's first. Riften's face suddenly hardened. He grabbed her by the arm and dragged her all the way to the front of the carriage. You're my wife. I'm taking my wife with me, and whose permission should I heed? Even your father has no power to interfere. With such decisive words, he lifted her inside with his robust arms and made her sit on the carriage seat. The mystified look from Max's face wouldn't leave. My wife, he said, and here she thought he was going to proceed with the divorce. Her thoughts were spiraling out of control inside her head. Go. He sat opposite of her, shouting at the people outside of the carriage, and a moment later the wagon began to rattle. Max looked towards Castle Cross in bewilderment. She had imagined countless of times the different ways her reunion with her husband would have gone. However, this current development was far from the premeditated scenes in her anxious mind. Why are you taking me with you? Max could only muse internally the question, looking at her husband with wide eyes like a doe. Riften was looking out at the landscape with his arm over the window, looking remarkably calm, as if he had never dragged her out in a thunderbolt after he suddenly rained kisses on her. King Reuben has urged him to an engagement with his royal daughter. He won't miss this chance. The Duke of Cross was like the devil on her shoulder, repeating the damning words to her ear. But it was not only the Duke who thought so, even she believed in it. Princess Agnes, who was the royalty to be engaged to him, was a reputable magician. And one of the heroes who played a part in the excursion for the Red Dragon. The romantic story of the 2 similar souls who were fighting together on the battlefield and turning into lovers blew like a gentle wind throughout the city. Those who had caught whiff of this tale expected a grand wedding upon their return. The famous warrior, Riften, and the gifted magician, Princess Agnes. And in her thoughts, she thought a divorce was imminent, spiraling down her like an unstoppable avalanche. Even the priest who had presided over their wedding would have thought so. Not a soul was unaware of how Duke Cross tyranny was the reason for their marriage. He had a legitimate cause and justification for demanding a divorce. But why did you? She stole a glance towards Riften's side profile. The breeze that drifted into their carriage played with his locks, swaying them gently. His frosty countenance, one he must have developed after the severe expedition, served to create an unapproachable atmosphere. His untidy hair was even cluttered like a bird's nest on his forehead, and his burnt, golden skin gave his handsome appearance an even more exotic atmosphere. Max had never seen Princess Agnes in person, but she did hard tales of her great beauty. Brilliant, blonde locks and deep blue eyes like the ocean. She had no doubt that if she were to stand next to him, they would look like people from a beautiful painting. Thinking so, she took a cautious peek at her reflection on the carriage window. The sight of a wide forehead, the small, low bridge of her nose, and a face that to her looked weird because of her large eyes, greeted her. Brown freckles rested on the top of the nose like drizzled dirt, and her hair, which had been braided to control her rebellious curls, still had wayward hairs sticking out like straw. Only terrible thoughts were present inside her head. She was convinced he didn't want her to be his wife. There must be something else. What do you want me to do? She thought, at the receiving end of her fears. As if noticing her scrutinizing him, and the doubtful gaze from her eyes, he finally glanced back at her. Caught by his piercing eyes, Max quickly lowered her head. The man found her action disconcerting and spat out a small curse. Even though it feels terrible to be with me, try to hide your repulsion. I have no intention of leaving this carriage because of a faint-hearted wife. With his ever-increasing agitation, Max hurriedly said, "Oh, no, no. It's not terrible. No, I never said that." In that case, what's with that look of disgust? He venomously spat out a second later. In impulse, Max hurriedly raised her hands to cover her face. While it was true that confusion made her scared and jittery, she was belatedly mindful of how she must have looked to him with her depressing emotions on display. It must have made him feel unpleasant. The debut release happened at N0V3 Elbin. I know you are well aware how our situation, he gestured to both of them, is not ordinary. The man sighed at her stubborn silence. Only unbeknownst to him, Max was sweating profusely in anxiety. He continued, more level-headedly this time, I don't know much about you. I'm sure it's the same for you. But you're my wife now, and I must take you with me throughout my days, as the vows declare. But how can I regard you as my wife if you shiver so much just by being next to me? All your life. Why you are taking me? Her astonished look made his face distort, in fury or of something else. Max was already lost. We got married 3 years ago. Isn't it the heavens' will for a married couple to live together forever? She looked at him as if a second head had sprouted from his wide neck. She couldn't believe it. Such a person truly had no intention of breaking off their marriage? Perhaps he is lying for some reason. Maybe his words are to mock me because he thinks I haven't heard of his engagement to the princess. Despite his words, the thoughts in Max's head only proceeded to an abysmal path. Even a native like me knows the importance of marriage vows. I can't believe that a noble lady like you ignored it thoroughly. He fired back at her in confusion. What do you mean, ignore? What the hell do you call it? You married me, and you completely ignored your duties so casually. Don't expect me to put up with such an attitude in the future. She opened her mouth in astonishment. How could he make such accusation? The day after their wedding, he left without saying a word. I didn't know. You didn't tell me. He seemed unimpressed with her defense, so she added, I never ignored, no. Oh, rather, I've been waiting. Don't mess with me. You've stayed at your father's castle for the past 3 years, even though you're called Mrs. Calypse. You just chose to remain in your father's luxurious castle, despite knowing I had to leave my estate right after the wedding. He snorted loudly. However, I seem to understand. No aristocratic woman in the world will give up her high position and protect her husband's house, who may return as a corpse. Max ran out of strength to answer, deeply embarrassed by his accusation that she couldn't refute a word. This man was just saying things he couldn't understand. But she couldn't let this go. This marriage, she was determined to save at all cost. So, she said. Your house, how do I know about it? Where is it? Anything. You did not say anything. Don't play innocent. I did everything I could to get you to come and stay in my estate before I left for the army. When I die, you were supposed to inherit the estate that I was managing. The Duke's daughter may have no concern to me, but it was an important asset which you left it completely unattended. Anger was evident in his face. It didn't seem like he was faking a lie. He has no reason to deceive her in the first place anyway. Max could only swallow nervously. I didn't know, not a bit. My men said you refused to leave. He spoke bitterly, to which Max bowed her head in shame. Don't bother acting sorry so suddenly. I've known what you think of me for the last 3 years. Riftan had always been aware of how everyone looked down on his status, a knight in the mercy of his superiors. And he was convinced that Maximilian felt just the same towards him. Darn it, why are you suddenly talking this time? Do you think I'll beat you up if you don't? I am sorry. I really didn't know. When I woke up after our night two together, you're already gone. I didn't hear any parting words from you. Riftan squinted his eyes at her, trying with all his might to see if she was indeed telling the truth. All the while, like a lamb to be slaughtered, Max waited for his next words, her heart beating rapidly against her chest. At the next moment, much to her surprise, the man spat out in a slightly softened tone. Even if I didn't instruct you, you should have left for my estate. It is the natural duty of a married woman to spearhead her husband's house. This marriage might seem so small to you, but to me, it isn't. Max found no possible contradiction to what he said. Though she did not treat their marriage as trivial as what he was insinuating, it was true that she didn't take it so seriously and had only wanted to follow her father's orders. How come he took the marriage at heart? Their marriage was, after all, only an inevitable sacrifice for the sake of the Cross family. What if you were pregnant? Pregnant? Max, who was lost in her own thoughts, looked up at him nervously. That night, I certainly fulfilled my duty enough. Isn't pregnancy a possible story? The sarcasm that dripped from his mouth drained all colors from her face. Their intimate moment remained a painful and shameful memory to her. Even though she knew that the deed was for the purpose of establishing their marriage, she still felt uneasy whenever the memories of that night resurfaced to her mind. But he was making such light remarks as if it were no big deal to him. Max trembled in fear. However, her sudden change of demeanor didn't escape Riftan's notice, and he once again felt agitated at her reaction. He struck the wall with a loud bang. Darn it, don't look like that. Like it's horrible to have my child. Max could only shiver in fear at his outburst. In the next second, far from his previous display of ire, Riftan assumed a calm state and became eerily silent. With quick movements, he suddenly put his hand on the carriage door, using it as a leverage, and jumped out of the running vehicle. Max screamed in surprise. Sir! An ogre has been sighted, one of his men cried from outside. I know. Put the shield around the carriage, now. After giving orders to someone, he looked back at her and cried sharply. Never come out of the carriage. Then, he roughly closed the carriage door without waiting her answer. At that same moment, a deafening roar shook the earth. Maximilian covered her ears in defense to the monstrous sound. Every time the earth shook, the carriage wobbled under her feet. In a terrible shock and fear, she crouched to the floor and didn't dare look out the window. Recently, she heard vaguely that there were frequent sightings of monsters near her home, but it's been less than an hour since she left her father's castle. She closed her eyes tightly, her whole body trembling terribly. Make it stop. She swallowed a sob. The carriage shook violently at the end of someone's cry. Then came the roars of beasts and shouts of knights, which almost sounded inhumane and barbaric to her ears. Overwhelmed by the sudden shift in events, she buried her face deep in her bulbous skirt. Around her, continuous dull sounds that seemed to collide with something resonated. What could that be? Hesitantly, she raised her head slowly in fear that of hitting carriage ceiling and was greeted with a sight that would surely haunt her for life. Huge, bloodshot, green eyes were staring at her from the window. In reflex, she screamed and stood close to the other side. But it was too late. Her small body flipped in the air, her world turning upside down as the carriage lost its balance. She screamed at the top of her lungs and tried to reach the opposite carriage wall where the door was located, but just couldn't. Then, the vehicle jolted to the opposite direction and Max was flung towards the now wide-open door. And in no time, she found herself kissing the ground, the rocks digging in her skin. In the face of danger, Max became ghastly pale, thoroughly shaken of being out of her safe haven. With little strength she could muster, she scrambled back up to the carriage, but her legs seemed to not work, her body, overwhelmed by the turn of events, became weak and numb. She looked around for help. But everyone was busy fighting the gray giants. Eventually, she crawled on her knees and tried to climb up the carriage on her own. As she did so, one ogre caught sight of her and started creeping nearer the damsel in distress. Heavy foot thumping became louder and clearer. Upon realization, Max screamed out loud, her throat hurt. This scream added fuel to the fire as the giant started advancing faster. Before the monster could reach her, a flash of light flashed across her eyes and the giant's body fell to the ground in a loud, earth-shattering thud. "Madam, get inside now. There's a shield here where it's safe." She looked back abruptly on her shoulder and saw a man of slender build, calling her attention. "This is an ogre from the mountain. Don't worry, nothing wrong will happen to Lord Calypso. Stay inside." "Oh, I didn't mean to come out." Max groaned out in panic. Riften's order not to come out of the carriage echoed in her mind. She didn't mean to disturb the men at all. "Madam, go inside. Please." The man broke off to his gibberish. She wanted to tell him what happened, but it was not the time to be making excuses. Instead, she willed herself to climb up the carriage with a wobbly gait when she heard another thud. Unconsciously turning her head to the source of sound, Max saw blood sprouting from the gushing cut at the giant's upper body, which spurted blood like a fountain. Her stomach, which had been strained for the past few days, twisted painfully. She tried to hold back the bile rising up her throat, but to no avail. She ended up emptying her stomach to the ground unabashedly. The enormity of the sight she had just seen making her vomit on the very spot she stood. "Madame Calypso!" the man shouted in surprise. She clawed at her neck desperately, her eyes welling up tears in pain. "Are you all right?" Gasping for breath, she tried to find comfort at the touch on her back, but the nausea that started once was hard to stop. "What's going on?" A familiar voice reached her ears. Max raised her head at the startled voice of Riften. He stood by the giant's body, looking at her worriedly. Instinctively, Max crept backwards, the bloodied appearance of her husband frightening her. As he strode closer, dark red spots of blood taints the ground his feet touches. The sharp sword which shone blue was now scarlet red, and the silver-white armor became ink-dark with thick, black blood of the giant all over it. He looked as horrible as a lion in hell. Max backed off, lost her balance and stumbled towards the carriage wall. In her sight, his figure shook like a hazy dream and soon became strangely distorted. She felt dizzy. Slowly, everything was devoured by darkness, and the sounds surrounding her faded away. And before she knew it, she sank deep into unconsciousness.